Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a couple of housekeeping items. Most importantly, the breakfast snacks that we committed to are in the far corner, and they actually evolved into breakfast tacos and fruit. So I'm really happy about that. Beverages, as you can see, are also available. The restrooms are directly out the doors. And I understand we're all very busy and we all receive phone calls and stuff, but if during these 2 hours you could silence your cell phones, that would be awesome. I'm not saying don't check them, just silence them. So, the Immigrant Services Network of Austin, which has been in existence since 2003, convened this informational session because it aligns firmly with our identity as a working group of diverse community stakeholders and immigrant service providers operating together to coordinate efforts, increase public awareness, and inform policy to better serve the immigrant community. Today we are here to learn about the unaccompanied children situation from 5 different professionals with direct experience, so to inform how our community might respond. We will be discussing the potential response upon conclusion of today's informational session. Please keep in mind that today we will not be addressing larger immigration reform needs. Rather, we want to focus our attention on this specific crisis and its local implications. Also, we're planning on sharing a summary of today's discussions through the ISNA listserv, and we are very happy to have Aaron here today filming, and we will be posting what he records on the ISNA website as well, so feel free to share that with other colleagues. With that, I'd like to begin our discussion. I'm going to ask that you hold your questions until the end of the panel. There are 15 minutes that we've allocated for that. Since we're short on time and it's important for us to be respectful of your time, we have, you'll see that on each of your chairs there are some note cards, and those are for our moderated discussion. So what I'm going to ask is, if you have any questions throughout the course of the present panel, you fill them out. Midway, I'm going to ask you to pass them forward. The panel will continue, and then we'll use the questions that you've written to kind of, field questions over here to our speakers. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today. And actually what I'm thinking is I'm going to go through the panel, introduce them all, and then let them do their own thing so I'm not constantly interrupting them. Our first speaker today is Amy Thompson. She is an immigration policy analyst and a PhD student at the University of Texas. She specialized in issues related to unaccompanied children in the U.S. immigration system for over 15 years. The Center for Public Policy Priorities recently re-released her 2008 report on the removal and deportation of unaccompanied children by the United States, a child alone and without papers, given its relevance to proposed interventions for the current child refugee population along the border. She's a member of ISNA and is its immediate past chair. And Charlotte Patterson, right here to my left, I have to do that L to remember, is a design and communications professional who regularly provides pro bono services to area schools and nonprofits. She is here today in the view of Sara Bonds, the founder of Circle of Health International. Circle of Health International is an Austin-based organization that has been responded to humanitarian crisis around the world for over 10 years. Cohi recently traveled to McAllen to conduct a needs assessment over the July 4th weekend and to provide a team of volunteer clinicians, both to help Cohi determine its role in the ongoing emergency response and to hear directly from the refugee children and families about the needs as they articulate them. Alexandra, Minnaar, and Jonathan Ryan are here from RAICES. I have Alex's bio, so I'll read it. I'm just going to let Jonathan fill in for himself because I didn't get his on time. But he is the executive director. Alex is a graduate of Northeastern University School of Law and has been practicing immigration law with the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, RAICES, since 2008. She is currently a staff attorney at RAICES' Austin office, where she represents primarily refugees, Cuban entrants, asylum seekers, and family-based immigration applicants. Prior to working at the Austin office, Alexandra was the program director for RAICES' children program in San Antonio, where she oversaw RAICES' legal orientation program for detained unaccompanied minor children and trained and mentored pro bono attorneys. Do you want to fill in the gap now for yourself, Jonathan?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Ryan. I'm the executive director of RAICES. Before that, I was a staff attorney here in Austin at then and Papa, now American Gateways. I was a graduate of the University of Texas School of Law and worked in the immigration clinic there with Professor Hines. I'm very happy to be here.
And finally, we have Sara Ramirez from Catholic Charities of Central Texas. Sara Ramirez has over 12 years in nonprofit leadership. Prior to coming to Catholic Charities of Central Texas in October 2013, Sara served 9 years in senior executive roles at Catholic Charities of Fort Worth. During her tenure, the organization's operating budget grew from $8 million to $23 million, and Sara led an advancement department that increased fundraising efforts by 94%, raising over $19 million to advance the mission. Sara received her BA in psychology from Texas Tech University and her MA in social work from the University of Texas at Arlington. With that, we'll begin with you, Amy.
Good morning. I'm going to try to resist the temptation to go down bunny trails. So Angela and I have known each other for a long time, so don't be alarmed if she starts to hit me. She has permission to do that. I'm here to talk to you today about the evolution of policy for receiving unaccompanied children in the U.S. And in 10 minutes, that's going to be a tall order. So I'm going to go ahead and cheat by starting in the 1990s, as long as you all promise to understand that there have always been unaccompanied children coming to our border since the beginning of time, because this is unaccompanied child migration is a phenomenon that dates back to the beginning of human existence. So we'll cheat a little. Okay, the 1990s. You may picture this era as the Dark Ages. During the Clinton administration, when kids were detention was ramping up and more people were being held for longer periods of time, there was no separation or distinction between children and adults, or unaccompanied children and adults. During this time period, unaccompanied children were detained with adult populations, and without special facilities, that meant INS contracted populations of the kind that you may remember. Federal prisons, criminal facilities, children were mixed with the adult criminal population. So advocacy and pro bono community efforts really focused in this period around trying to improve conditions for these kids, and they brought a class action lawsuit which resulted in a settlement agreement to establish some standards of care for detention for these kids. These standards were very base. They needed toilets. You have to give them water and food. You can't put them in a room with an adult sex offender. It wasn't cush. They were limited in what they could achieve for this population because they were still forced to receive these children within a law enforcement paradigm. They were still under INS custody. So also important to point out that during this period, apprehension rates for unaccompanied children and demographics of which children were coming from which countries is unknown, because INS did not keep records based on age groups or country of origin groupings like that. So we don't have any really good historic data. We have anecdotal data from people who were in the fields at that time period and can give you their impressions. Mexican children were sometimes, because this was a period of lawlessness, sometimes just immediately returned at the border, but they were sometimes also detained. They may have ended up in prisons with the rest of the children, but they sometimes were just dumped on the border with absolutely no paperwork. So, and that depended on their point of apprehension and just the individuals involved. It was very, very arbitrary. So then we fast forward to the effects of 9/11 and the Homeland Security Act on this system. Homeland Security Act dissolved INS and created an opportunity for advocates to help frame a new space and a new paradigm for the receipt of unaccompanied children. So under the Homeland Security Act, the custody of unaccompanied children is transferred to Health and Human Services and Office of Refugee Resettlement. like we see today, but only children who are not from Mexico. So Mexican children continue to be repatriated via expedited removal. ORR during this time period is seen anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 kids in its shelters a year. At the time that custody was transferred from Immigration Enforcement to Health and Human Services, there was not infrastructure in place. So initially, a lot of the shelters that kids were being transferred into under HHS care were really the same contractors that they were being held in under former INS care. And so there was an initial struggle to really improve conditions, but also to rapidly expand who all was running shelters. And so that's when you start seeing Catholic Charities and Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services opening up the more group home looking like shelters that you may be more familiar with today. But because of the formalization of a bifurcated process for Mexican children and children from other countries, you really start to see the Mexican children became more and more invisible in the process. Advocacy efforts really focused on pro bono, providing pro bono services for kids who were in ORR care because there was just no access to get to the children from Mexico who were being immediately expedited. So once the kids are in ORR care, contractors provide case management and wraparound services. They facilitate access to attorneys and know your rights presentations. And kids who have some claim for relief may be released to the care of a guardian. Because of the continued opaque nature with how children from Mexico were returned, we still don't really know apprehension rates for Mexican children and demographics related to them during this period. Department of Homeland Security, immigration enforcement agencies such as Border Patrol kept their data on these kids very, very inconsistently, and there's really no way to pull good numbers, but we do have numbers from Mexican immigration authorities and demographers that indicate at least 35,000 unaccompanied children were being returned to Mexico a year during this period, although the number of kids crossing either from Mexico or unaccompanied or other countries is not known. So that brings us to present. So around 2005, 2006, attorneys who were representing these kids and social workers were having a hard time answering kids' questions for the ones who weren't getting relief and who were facing deportation, what was going to happen to them when they returned. Advocacy efforts switched to trying to draw back the veil on what was happening with regards to repatriation and deportation. And there were some studies, like the study I did that Angela mentioned, that revealed that kids were actually being repatriated under no formalized system and to very, very dangerous situations. So in 2008, there was a watershed piece of legislation, the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which you may have heard a lot about in the news recently. That act provided two things for unaccompanied children. One, screening for whether or not they were at risk of trafficking or eligible for other types of relief prior to their return to country of origin, and a pilot project to be developed into a fully fledged program for safe repatriation of these children. Neither of these, although currently the TVPRA is getting a lot of flack, neither of these provisions was ever really implemented. When the act Act was passed, the insertion of the provisions was the result of years of advocacy by child welfare specialists and human rights attorneys and law enforcement. And they recognized the need for active interventions to end child trafficking, which is just one of the many dangers that unaccompanied children are susceptible to, as well as the need to offset the unequal access to protections that unaccompanied children from Mexico face. But there was really, between that time and now, no signs of implementation, and studies were showing over and over that Border Patrol was not administering the required screenings. Oh, good God, that's not gonna work. Okay, so long story short, so this year UNHCR came out with their report that was able to identify that yes, we are having a increase of unaccompanied children coming from Central America. I just wanted to point out 2 quick misconceptions before we move on. Can I have a minute and a half?
1 minute and a half.
Like my negotiation skills? Okay. So there's a lot of misinformation making its rounds in the media today, and I want to draw your attention to 2 misconceptions that I hope this brief history may have helped to debunk. But one is that USC migration, unaccompanied child migration, is not a point-in-time emergency. They are part of every migrant and refugee population. And 2 is that unprecedented numbers of children are crossing the border. We can't say that definitively in the first place because we can't know how many children are crossing the border. What we're seeing, though, is we're seeing an unprecedented number of kids coming into ORR care at this point in time. The takeaway here is that unaccompanied kids will keep showing up at our door. There are fluctuations due to regional conflict and natural disasters, but what's changed over time that's significant is not the nature or size of the population, but how we receive them. And that's what our conversation today is about. Media attention and public awareness of this topic is very, very, very temporary. There have been a lot of instances in which unaccompanied children have made it into the media cycles in the last 20 years. The public does not retain this information very well. The topic of unaccompanied children is in and out of news cycles and public consciousness, and people will forget this soon. I hope not, but in all likelihood they will. The laws may get worse, possibly today. They may get much, much worse. But there will always be kids showing up. And so that begs the question of, and leads us to the challenge of why we're here today, which is how can we as a community respond and to this population's needs and receive unaccompanied children. It's a diverse population that fluctuates dramatically over time. How can we create and sustain an infrastructure for child refugees that's scalable based on fluctuations in levels of migration, resourceful in meeting the diverse and changing support needs of the community, and resilient in politically contentious climates today?
Well, I'm very happy to be here on behalf of Circle of Health International today. Sara Bonds, their founder, is traveling today, but she's also very excited that we're a part of this, and really excited about the role that Circle of Health can play at the border right now. So as Angela mentioned, COE sent a team to McAllen earlier this month. There were 3 purposes. They brought $5,000 and donated supplies. They sent a medical team that worked for just about 72 hours straight to relieve clinic staff in McAllen. And they also performed a detailed needs assessment. So they were documenting and observing the needs there. And so my presentation goes over some of the findings and of what we see as the needs and how COE can play a role in that, and what the solutions are. So, the problem, which I know probably everyone in this room is pretty familiar unaccompanied minors, 90,000 this year. They're traveling a really long distance. It's a dangerous journey. They're being housed in one of 961 detention facilities, and a large number are fleeing violence and difficult situations in their home countries. And they're also risking a lot of violence in the journey here. So this chart, there's a lot of numbers that are probably hard to read if you're very far back, but basically it talks about statistically the health of the people coming to the border right now. So just to summarize, what they're seeing are a population that's experiencing high birth rates, early childbearing with limited access to family planning. There's been a lot of exposure to violence and trauma. So consequently, they have compromised physical and psychological health. That's only been, a problem that's been compounded by the long journey that they've been through. So just to call attention to a couple of numbers, like the fertility rate in Guatemala and El Salvador, it's 5.1, 3.6. In the U.S., it's closer to 2. Maternal mortality rate, Honduras, 148. In the U.S., it would be close to 18. So just to give you some context for those numbers. So our findings, and this is kind of really the meat of what I'm here to talk about today, is what the team there saw as the major needs for this population. So Kelly was there for 72 hours. We're working with the Sacred Heart Church in the clinic that group had set up. And so, first of all, clinical needs, pediatric and adolescent health care is a huge need there. Treating people with severe dehydration and malnourishment. The clinic itself requires staff, medicine and supplies, and also dental care is another huge need that they're seeing. Psychological needs, as I talked about, this population that's experienced trauma. Currently, there is no psychological care at the facility. That's just not something that they've been able to offer at this point. The staff, the COE staff did notice or observe psychosomatic issues, and just definitely from talking to the refugees, it's just clear that there's been a lot of experience of trauma. Just anecdotally, one child they saw was 11 and she was pregnant and terrified. So we had another girl come in, she was in labor. So just, so the psychological part of that is important as well. Coordination is really a huge piece of it. So the people of McCallum and Catholic Charities there have just been doing so much work, really opened their hearts, but obviously everything's happening really fast. So COE feels like there's a need for a partner that can go there and really coordinate services, help set up training for volunteers, training people to train volunteers, and that would include vetting, background checks, very important. Also training people for how to work with the specific population of refugees, and working with the charities there. So just being a central point of coordination for all of this. And lastly, also providing a system for following up with refugees after they leave, so that there's still something in place as they move out of the detention centers. So this is what Circle of Health sees as the solution. So an experienced relief organization, such as Circle of Health International, can provide counseling, can provide infectious disease screening. So right now, that's not really happening in an organized way. A lot of the refugees are, being quickly leaving the detention centers without having this screening taking place. So they were seeing a lot of respiratory infections. So they really think it's important to go ahead and diagnose and treat that and help the population in that way. Circle of Health is also experienced in procuring essential supplies, and that's something that's a key need here. Sexual and reproductive health services, training, as I just talked about, community engagement, pre and postnatal care are something that's important for this population, as well as gynecological care. Legal advocacy is a big part of that, and so COE would really love to partner with another group in that piece of this, and family planning education. So Circle of Health International, just to give you a little bit more background on the group. Mission, working with children in their communities in times of crisis and disaster. So they tend to go in areas where there's a refugee crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a disaster, and they really focus on children and moms. That's their huge focus, and there's not a lot of other groups that are really specific to that, but obviously that's a really nice fit with what we're seeing at the border right now. The organization is 10 years old. They've worked all over the world, Jordan, Haiti, Syria, Philippines. They also work locally. They've worked in New Orleans, Oklahoma after disasters, and they also operate a clinic here in Central Texas for victims of human trafficking. So again, just a really good, they have a lot of experience with the needs of the population at the border. Experts in logistics, supply procurement, long-term training, experience working with and identifying and documenting human rights abuses. So Sara has been approached with a lot of questions about how individuals can help or how other organizations can help. So this goes over some of those things. Volunteers, of course, are key, particularly in this instance. They're looking for bilingual and bicultural volunteers, experts in refugee issues, and clinical volunteers. So that would include healthcare workers with experience in pediatrics, dental needs, OBGYN. Looking for partnerships with human rights organizations and agencies specializing in immigration and refugee populations. Sara feels like it's really important for the groups to work together in a coordinated way, so we're definitely looking for partners in our efforts down there. So her particular plea, please include COE in coalition, collaboration, and committee lists serving the refugees. So we very much want to be a part of this. And lastly, funding, of course, is always important. And so this is the budget that she specifically worked out. So clinical operations, local staffing, nutritional programming. So just to speak to that specifically, and I'm going to wrap up. Thank you, Connie. So there's just, this population has huge nutritional needs, malnourished, and COE has a lot of experience with feeding populations that specific, so it's not just, making them a few sandwiches. It's a very specific program, and she feels like it's really important to feed people to help them. So, and she partners with other groups, including Cliff Bar is one of the groups that they work with. Legal advocacy, and so that comes out to a total budget of $260,000 for 6 months of operations. And we did get a gift from a private donor to pay for 3 months of clinical services in McAllen. So that's a huge kickstart for us. So we're really ready to be on the ground there. There's an existing clinic that's not being used right now that was recently used, but it's available. And it's just around the corner, basically, from the Catholic Charities group. So that wraps it up for me. If anybody has questions, of course, we'll talk during the panel, or if you would like to work with COE, just come up to me after the session. Thank you so much.
Hello, hi, good morning everybody. How are you doing? Good morning. Good, hi. My name is Jonathan Ryan, and I'm an immigration attorney, and I'm the director of RAICES, or the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services in San Antonio, Texas. We also have 2 attorneys who office here at Charities. You may know them if you work here, Ms. Alexandra Minnaar and Sara Valdez there in the audience. So RAICES has been in existence in San Antonio since 1986, and we provide free and low-cost services to underserved immigrant children, families, and refugees in Central and South Texas. We have 7 different legal programs that work with populations from dreamers to detained survivors of torture to families applying for family petitions and citizenship, and our largest program now, which is a program with unaccompanied children who are in the custody of HHS and those who have been released from HHS. Since 2008, we have been a subcontractor in a network of service providers that provide legal access services to children who are in these HHS-funded shelters. So when we started doing this work in September of 2008, we were providing services to 30 children in San Antonio, and a shelter that could hold up to 70 children in Corpus Christi, but that usually maintained a population of about 35 to 45 children. Well, since that time, we've grown. And our staff of about 5, I was the 5th staff person at RAICES, this year we'll be topping out at potentially 60 people, including 25 attorneys, most of whom are all dedicated to nothing but providing services, free services to these children. The numbers of children have increased year over year, nearly doubling that we have been working with. So this issue that has come to the national forefront has been with us here locally and regionally for many years and honestly many decades. RAICES has informally, before any of us were there, working with unaccompanied minors back in the dark ages. And unfortunately we may be heading back into some dark times. Since June 9th of 2014, we have been providing Know Your Rights presentations and individual legal screenings to the unaccompanied minors who are at the Lackland Air Force Base. RAICES was the first non-contracted legal service provider to enter into any of the Department of Defense locations that Health and Human Services resorted to when their capacity was exceeded by the influx of children. So there were other bases that were opened up, one in Oklahoma State at Fort Sill, and another in Ventura, California. And so to date, we have completed individual screenings for more than 1,400 children at the base. And in fact, as of yesterday, have completed providing Know Your Rights presentations and individual screenings to all of the children who are at Lackland. At this point, they are no longer receiving new intakes to the Air Force bases or the military installations. There's a population today at Lackland of a little more than 700, down from the nearly 1,200 that they had just about 2 weeks ago, and they're releasing those children at a rate of less than 14 days of stay. So we anticipate that in 2 to 3 weeks, the Lackland facility will be closed. The Oklahoma should probably be closed sooner. They're at about 400, and Ventura has, I believe, somewhere between 200 and 300. So the Department of Defense installations for the UAC should be closing relatively soon, and children placed into about 3,000 beds, permanent beds, that have been created around the nation, principally in areas like New York. We haven't seen a massive increase in the permanent beds here in this region, and one reason is that we've really experienced our heavy curve of permanent beds over the last 2 or 3 years. As a result of having completed over 1,400 individual legal consultations, where we are completing a multi-page intake that we have developed that has about 50 questions, some short answers, some very open-ended and long answer questions, that gives us information that helps us to be able to determine whether these children may be eligible for some form of relief before an immigration judge. And when I say relief before an immigration judge, this means that they may be able to gain their permanent U.S. residence through some humanitarian protection pursuant to our immigration and nationality law, our existing and long-standing immigration and nationality law that date well before the 2008 law that is receiving such attention right now. The forms of relief that children may be found eligible for include asylum for those who have been persecuted or may fear persecution in their home country. There is also a special protection for minors who have been victims of extreme forms of abuse, abandonment, neglect, or other treatment that may be a crime under our state laws. There are also protections for children who have been victims of human trafficking and children who have been victims of crimes, but the crimes have to have a nexus here to the United States. Oftentimes you might see these in terms of Border Patrol abuse. Based on our consultations and our screenings, we have determined that at least 63% of the children at the Lackland Air Force Base are likely to be found eligible by an immigration judge for relief from removal. This finding flies in the face of many of the statements that have been made by the administration and public officials that these children are not refugees, that they are not eligible to defend their deportation, and that they will be returned home. These are the allegations that are written in every charging document, in every deportation case that we attend. These are the statements that every trial attorney makes in the first 5 minutes of every asylum case, every one of the hundreds of asylum cases that all of us have won over the past many years. And then the final words that those trial attorneys state is, "Thank you, Jonathan, thank you, Sara, thank you, Alexandra, for being here, because without your help, this person would have never convinced me that they were eligible for this relief. Your Honor, I waive appeal." This is how our litigation works. In our history, we have a 98% success rate in the cases that we bring to immigration judges based on this eligibility criteria. So these numbers are backed up by literally hundreds and hundreds of successful adjudications for our unaccompanied child clients over the past many years. I could go through a bit of the ABCs of what happens to these UAC as they arrive to the border, and potentially also talk a little bit about the legislative updates. I'm going to steal a few of Alexandra's minutes, if I might. I'm kind of I'm the sub, and so we currently have a legal structure that is controlled by a law that was passed in 2008 under the George Bush presidency, and it was passed unanimously by the House and the Senate, by many of the individuals in our Congress who are today advocating that it change. So this law itself did not just spring out of Zeus's head, okay? It is based on a 2000 law. The 2008 law is called the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. And it is a reauthorization of a 2000 law that was the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Now, as well as these two acts, we have a settlement from Reno versus Flores that was addressed previously. And this was litigation that effectively took the children out of the custody of the prosecuting agency. They basically figured out that these guys are prosecuting these children. It's probably not a good idea to have them also serving as custodian. Now, this settlement and the litigation that led to it is based on constitutional principles. So as we see the government talking about inserting flexibility or rolling back this law, they are up against our U.S. Constitution that led to the findings that really enshrine the angles of this law. Principle among them include the fact that children should be reunified, or as the law states, in the least restrictive setting. And as anybody knows, that setting cannot be in the custody of a federal government, but rather in a home-like setting with a guardian, a relative, or a next friend. So they may try to change the law, but lawyers like us may try to sue the hell out of them. So when a child arrives at the border, pursuant to this settlement and to the law, they are to be screened by Border Patrol, who is the first one to apprehend the child. There are three fundamental questions. One is, are you a child? If they find out they're a child, then they need to go to question 2. Are you accompanied? If the child is not accompanied, now the child may physically be accompanied. The child may physically be accompanied with a guardian, with a family member. Could be a parent, could be an aunt, could be a sibling, a cousin, a relative. But if they don't have that birth certificate tree and marriage license tree to really prove at the border this familial relationship, the Border Patrol is going to presume that it's not a familial relationship. And this, to some extent, is based on some tradition of traffickers and smugglers feigning family relationships in order to get kids across the border. So if they find that the kid is not accompanied, then it is an unaccompanied child, okay? If it's an unaccompanied child, the next question is, where are you from? pursuant to our law, if the child is from Mexico or Canada, our contiguous countries, then the Border Patrol is tasked with interviewing the child to determine whether or not it is safe for that child to be returned, or, as they say, allowed to withdraw her request for admission and return to their country. It's a legal fiction. And so the presumption is supposed to be that this child will face some form of abuse or trafficking if they are returned. Or if not, why are they here? And so the child must be able to present some form of evidence that assures that officer, that interviewing officer, that the child will in fact be safe and can in fact be returned to that country, to an organization or some sort of civil service organization that is equipped and competent to receive that child. If that is the case, then the child should be allowed to return. In fact, based on the numbers that we were reported and the few numbers of Mexican children that we see in the ORR system, it's clear that the Border Patrol is not capable, not willing, not able to provide these interviews as prescribed by law. It is certain that the interviews are much shorter, and we're talking about a big guy with a gun. What have these children been running from? Who have been charging bribes and threatening turning these kids over to the Zetas on their entire travel up to New York, up to the United States. And now they get here, and we want them to disclose the most intimately traumatic and tragic facts of their lives to someone who looks exactly like that, except for the fact that they don't speak the same language. At least the other guys spoke their language, right? So the Mexican kids overwhelmingly are being bounced back. If the child is not Mexican, then they're supposed to bring the child within 72 hours to an HHS facility. So they have 48 hours to determine whether or not this is an unaccompanied child. A lot of people speak about the 72 hours, but it's in fact 5 days, because they have 48 hours just to figure out if it's an unaccompanied child. Then they have 72 hours to get the child out of their custody and into the custody of U.S. Health and Human Services. It's U.S. Health and Human Services that runs all the facilities we've been seeing about Lackland, the Air Force bases, all these shelters that all these good people have been protesting against coming to their cities, whether or not they were even planning on putting one there. And so the images that we saw that really launched this story into the news were of children packed like sardines into these boxes. I would say two things about that. One is, those are the nice boxes. Those are the nice ones. We've heard about much worse, for years. And this system of putting people into these frozen boxes has been going on for years. The reason they give is that it's supposed to contain contamination and the spread of disease. Have you ever been into such a cold hospital in your life? I have not. It's 55 degrees in these boxes. We're having children, the average, we've been running some data on our numbers, is 7 days for our kids right now, far exceeding the mandated number by law. We've had children report as many as 12 days in these boxes. So they keep them there. They then get them into the shelters where they begin to receive some services, some psychological services, but not in-depth therapeutic services. They're not clinical therapeutic services. They're really for making sure that the children behave, that they're not a threat to themselves or to others. But they do not engage in any therapy, except in extreme cases when they actually send the kid to a residential therapeutic center. One reason is that they don't know how long the kid is going to be there, and if you're opening up a therapeutic line, it can be very dangerous to just let that kid then out in the world while that's going on. So while they're at the shelters, the government initiates removal proceedings. All of these children are individually subject to deportation court. They all have to report to an immigration judge who is going to determine at the end of the day whether or not they stay here permanently or if they have to return to their home countries. It is a very adversarial, it is a high stakes, court proceeding, very Perry Mason-like. There are objections, there is cross-examination, there is impeachment, there is evidence that is poured over. It is just as tough as any court that you've ever been to. And the consequences are as or even more significant as any criminal conviction, because the result could very well be death. It's very much like the criminal courts, except it is considered civil in nature, and therefore they are not granted a right to a government-appointed attorney. You are, as an immigrant, allowed to request an attorney, a time to look for an attorney. You have a right to be represented by an attorney, but you have to pay for that attorney. So what our agency does is attempts to fill the gap of what really should be a public defender model. But the idea of providing lawyers to these children is not exactly flying right now in Capitol Hill. So with a vast majority of the children who are in HHS custody are reunified to family members. About 96% of all the children who are in these HHS facilities are reunified within 30 days Their target length of stay right now is 14 days. Many of the children are moving out that quickly. Of those children who are released, only 14% of the children who are in HHS custody remain in or transfer or reunified into the state of Texas. So a majority of the children that we work with, a vast majority, are going to states like Maryland, Georgia, Virginia, New York, California, Ohio, Florida. A lot of the emerging states that we're seeing that are really springing to the fore where these children are traveling to are in fact many of the states that passed the SB 1070-like bills over the past few years and saw a flight from their states of the adult, undocumented but long-term tied to the community population of agricultural workers. It appears the children are now flooding in to fill that gap. And so many of the children are going out there into this world. Our main job for these children, for most of them, is to act, as I say, like an illegal air traffic controller. We are attempting to match these children with pro bonos in Baltimore, in Atlanta, in Cleveland, in cities around the country, and we're calling 1, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 different nonprofit agencies in each city just to try to get the children a free consultation, a chance at maybe getting a pro bono representative in that city. For some children, a minority of them, they're not going to get out of the shelter. They truly are the ones who came here with nobody and don't have anybody to receive them. Or children might be reunified into our area and we meet them here. That's really, if you've seen us expand our presence here, this is because there are more and more over the past few years children who are reunifying into the San Antonio district, which includes Austin. So for those children who cannot get out, who are stuck, that's when our role as public defender or as defense attorney kicks in, and we represent them. In San Antonio, we have 75 beds of long-term foster care. So these are beds, 50 of them are foster care, 25 of them are in a group home of children who have been unable to be sponsored by any person in this country that have no family member, no family friend to take care of them. They're stuck in, and they're fighting a case. It's asylum, special immigrant juvenile status, etc. We represent these children and we can get them into this foster placement where they begin to integrate into our community. They're in the custody system, but they're attending local public high school. They're engaging in events. They're playing on the soccer team. You should see the trophy room at the group home. We are killing it. Very good. And thanks to this, well, as a consequence of this crisis, we are seeing an outpouring of support, members of the community, of agencies like never before. I think we're all excited. I think we've all saved about 5 minutes out of each of our days. We no longer have to explain to people what we do. It used to take some time. Like there was a time 3 months ago when I used to actually have to tell people, explain to them what it was we do, and now everybody knows. I could wrap up here. I could talk a little bit about the legislative updates, whatever you want.
If you want to take like maybe 5 minutes of the legislative updates,
Okay.
and then we'll go. Right.
You got your ledge updates?
Your negotiation skills weren't that good.
She's just like, that's okay. We'll
She
do
got
that
ledge
later.
No, that's fine if you got
No,
ledge
no,
updates.
no, no. I was
kidding.
just calling her because I had asked her in advance about that.
Well, there are basically 4 things on the table, and I just want to outline them so that when you're hearing the news, you know what's going on. Okay, there's a bill called the Humane Bill, okay, or the Humane Act, and this is being proposed by our Senator John Cornyn and Henry Cuellar, who's one of the congressmen from this state. So this is a rollback of the humanitarian protections of the TVPRA. It's bad, okay? It puts these children into an expedited removal. It keeps them detained. It's a railroading of their due process rights through this system. It's a round them up and send them home, cattle-style kind of litigation of act. Humane. You have to call it something like that, humane, just to get that word into the topic. This is both at the Senate and House level because it's partnered by both a senator and a House member. Okay. On the other side, we have a Senate bill that is proposed by Senator Mikulski that is a supplemental. It is funding for services for these children, but it is not going to change the law. So that is the Democratic proposal right now. There is no House of Representative partner for that legislation right now. So whereas the Republicans have a bill that's got both a House member and a Senate member sponsoring it, the Democrats only have a bill that's with the Senate. It passed yesterday. Now, the Humane Act by the Republicans, on the other hand, does not have any supplemental funding. It doesn't add funding to this system that's now been completely depleted. So there has to be a Republican supplemental bill put on the floor, and that's what was proposed 2 days ago, and it's even worse than the Humane Act. It will literally hold these children into detention. It will be the subject of, the ACLU, I'm sure, is just is just rubbing its hands together in anticipation of suing them over it. And so that's kind of the dynamics of where we stand. The two sides are very far apart. There's really no sign or thought that they're going to pass anything before going into the recess. There's some push to keep them there, but I don't think that they're going to want to stay in August. So we're going to have to see potentially in September how this plays out legislatively. But right now the numbers are going down, so the wind might be out of the sails a little bit in terms of this being a crisis. That might have been a bad word to use, because in many ways things are working at this moment in a very orderly way. So thanks.
Before we go on to Sara, do you guys have any questions that you'd like to send forward? Any questions that you wrote on your note cards? Sara?
Great. I'm going to be the rebel and stay seated because my chair is very comfortable. If you can't hear me, just let me know. My name is Sara Ramirez, and I'm the Executive Director for Catholic Charities of Central Texas. And for the past, I would say month and a half, we've been on conference calls with Catholic Charities across the state of Texas with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a recipient of Health and Human Services, to really assess and see what is happening. And I think Jonathan and Amy did a fantastic job on talking about Unaccompanied Minors 101 and what's really happening. The most latest update that we have, and they are, Amy, you did a great job discussing that these are just numbers, and that it's not really an indication that this hasn't been going on in the past. It's just who slips through the system. But when the humanitarian crisis was first identified, about 300 kids a day were crossing the border. And over the past couple of weeks, that number has decreased between 140 and 180 any given day. So as Jonathan was talking about at Lackland, where in the next couple of weeks they'll be shutting down the emergency shelter, that is the intent. That is a good thing. There are 94 94 permanent shelters across the United States that provide care for these children while they're trying to reunite them with family members or determine if they should go into an international foster care program. And so for that international foster care program, I don't know if you're hearing this, if your constituents are calling you and asking about this, but they'll say, how do I become a foster parent? And in the state of Texas, there are actually 2 foster care programs at the current time. One is in Fort Worth, Catholic Charities Fort Worth, and the other one is in Houston Galveston, Catholic Charities of Houston Galveston. And they have regulations and restrictions on how far out you can live from the main agency to be able to become a foster parent. But I'm really here, I guess, today to talk about looking forward. Where do we as a community, where should we be as a collective group, what's happening? And what we really see is there's 2 things. The first one is the emergency crisis response down on the border. What's going on there, what's happening? Ann talked about the group going down there and working. I can tell you that Catholic Charities, and they're not paying me to plug them, but Catholic Charities of Laredo is the one who started the McAllen Pass-Through Family Center. They started 2 in McAllen and another one in Brownville. And I'll tell you that Catholic Charities of Laredo has 10 full-time employees, and that's it. Wow. And they started this the day the emergency happened, and they've seen over 1,500 people pass through their shelter. And it's not Catholic Charities, it is all the community partners, all the other organizations, individuals on a global basis, faith groups that are joining together, going down there and providing that support. So from a local community, Austin, our Central Texas, what is needed in that, I will tell you that help down on the border is imperative. The children need the services, but they also need help with the media. I don't know how many of you are getting flooded with media calls right now regarding the situation, but it is so time consuming, and you want to respond because there's so much misinformation out there, and it's important to get the facts right and not change people's minds. We're not trying to do that. Well, yeah, we are. But get at least the facts. You can have your opinion, but know the facts before you make them. And so that's really important on the emergency end. But here in our community, looking forward, the children that are coming to Central Texas, and when I say Central Texas, I'm not meaning San Antonio, because I think of the region that our Catholic Charities serves, and San Antonio has their own Catholic Charities. But here in Travis County and 25 immediately surrounding communities, need for a shelter at this point in time is not needed. That could change in 3 months from now or next year, but at this point in time, that is not what the need is. The children that are being placed here in our community, they're being reunited with family members, individuals who have gone through home studies and determined that relationship and that they can care for the kids. And what is needed is legal representation for those children. And I'm going to talk about that for just a second. There's some great partnerships and great legal representatives in this community. One of the most important aspects behind the legal representation is to make sure pro bono attorneys or individuals who do not have experience in SIJ, which is Special Immigrant Juvenile Status cases, has the training and the resources to be able to do the work. We can actually do more harm than good for these children if we're not fully trained. And so making sure there's a really robust program. Is anyone here from American Gateways? Okay, so American Gateways, Volunteer Legal Services of America is getting ready, I'm totally plugging you, is getting ready to do a training for pro bono attorneys on the 5th.
It is on Wednesday, the 20th.
The 20th. Oh, sorry. So on the 20th, great. And where they have a very detailed curriculum for pro bono attorneys, and specifically looking for attorneys that are licensed in the state of Texas, because there are two courts that this goes through. One is the immigration courts, but SIJ cases in Texas also go through family court. And you have to be licensed in Texas to represent in family court. I may have missed that up a little bit, Jonathan,
You're
correct?
right on the money.
All right. And so that's a really important aspect. The second one is to remember that these kids are in our community. They are now our community members. And there is a huge fear that these families that these kids are being placed with are going to go underground. And out of fear of the media attention, the negativity that's out there, and when they go underground, their long-term needs are not going to be met. Legal services is just one of those aspects. These children have been through hell and back on this journey. They didn't come here just to make minimum wage and send money back home. This was the last resort for them and their families for their safety. And so that journey of coming over here, they've seen torture, they've been tortured, they've been human trafficked. Even when they got into the country, they may have been held captive and had to work as sex slaves before they were even released. So these kids have a lot of mental health issues, which Ann talked about. And being able to meet those needs, that's a long-term care for these children, as well as the families they're being placed with. Their biological families and relatives may have no clue how to handle someone who's seen that kind of violence, and they need help too. They're going to need financial support, case management, and it's long-term. Yes, we have a crisis on our border, but this isn't going away in a couple of months. This isn't going away in 9 months, whenever, if laws are passed, per se, and we don't have that influx coming across the border. When they're here, this is a long term, just like disaster response. It is long term. And so for our community, I think as a collective whole, the best thing we can do, this is number one, is joining everyone together. Having everyone in the room talking about the issue, what we're doing, and partnering together, not to be fragmented in our services, but that we have a no wrong door approach for the families when they walk through our doors. So they come into Catholic Charities, we don't have the service, we know who to connect them with, where we can do that continuity and wraparound approach. That will be very, very important to the families as they stay here. I believe that may be all I have, so I didn't even take my 10 minutes.
That's good.
I get a gold star.
If I could take a minute to just expand on Sarah's plug of American Gateways
Absolutely,
about training.
Yeah.
American Gateways, like Sarah said, is partnering with Volunteer Legal Services to provide a training on August 20th. It's a quick 2-hour training, so if anyone here is a licensed attorney in Texas, or has a friend that's a licensed attorney in Texas that would like to be involved and help the unaccompanied children. The training will be at McGinnis, Lockridge, and Kilgore on the 20th, August 20th at 11 a.m. And if you want more information, I'd be more than glad to answer your questions after the panel discussion. We also have a pro bono asylum program for some of these unaccompanied children. As some of you may already know, the Karnes Detention Center in Karnes, Texas is becoming a family detention center. And American Gateways, as soon as the families are moved in, is going to start going out there, and we're trying to locate pro bono attorneys to help these children and families applying for asylum and SIJ. So if you're interested or have a friend that's interested, I'd be more than glad to answer your questions and share more information.
Could you email that to me as well, so then I can send it out with a summary of today's event?
Robert, right?
Alfredo.
Alfredo.
Yes.
So just as an extension of that, to show that partnership, so Catholic Charities, our Catholic Charities of Central Texas, we have an immigration legal services program, and we've done a call out for volunteer attorneys. And I actually spoke with Elizabeth yesterday, and we're supposed to talk today. I heard about this training that they're putting on, and this is a whole aspect of why recreate a will. American Gateways has a great reputation. They do great training aspects. So how can Catholic Charities be a part of that? And we bring the attorneys that want to work with Catholic Charities to yours, where we can do one global partnership. Don't recreate a will, so we can spend more time serving the actual clients. And so I'm very appreciative of you all.
Great. Do we have any other questions that you'd like to send forward?
Ms. Lockridge, you can.
I should have asked for good handwriting, so otherwise I might call you out and ask you to read it yourself. Okay, so our first question is, how many permanent HHS beds are in San Antonio?
So that depends on what your day-to-day changes. Now, there are, before Lackland, there were 798 contracted beds in the San Antonio and Corpus area, about 600 in about 550 in San Antonio, and about 250 in Corpus Christi. Those numbers actually swelled up. They put more kids in those facilities than they were contracted for, to about 950, and then they took the 1,200 of Lackland and put it on top of that. So you're looking at about 2,150 beds, and it's shrinking down to about 1,100 probably after the surge.
Thank you. Another question. With regards to infectious disease screenings, it is my understanding that the state is trying to work with the federal government to perform health screenings at the front end rather than the back. Is that your understanding, and will you be partnering with them in some way? And I'm guessing that's directed to you guys.
I don't know. So I will get with Sara about that specifically, and I'll find out, and I'll forward the information to you so you can put in your synopsis.
Do you want to take the
Yep.
question? Okay.
Yep.
Again, for Kohi, what is the sample size for the needs assessments, and how many patients are going to be seen per day at the proposed clinic?
I'll make a note of that one too.
Okay. Let's see. We can do that one later. So another question is, if most children here in Central Texas are being placed with family members, how is that possible? Did the children come here knowing they were family members in the U.S.?
Well, that was one of the bullets that I skimmed over. But yes, family reunification is one of the major motivations for a lot of kids. 7% of Hondurans live in the United States, and that's, you know, a lot of parents who left some babies behind. And as the kids get older, they're facing really, really increasingly desperate circumstances. U.S. or Nicaragua, if your mom's in U.S., it's much more attractive.
I would qualify, maybe push back on that a little bit. I don't think reunification is the major motivation of children coming to the United States. They do make plans.
For Honduras.
They do make plans. Many of the kids are reunifying when they say family members. We're hearing kids who are reunifying with, like, the cousin of my stepmom, my aunt's nephew. I mean, it's tenuous relationships. Many times it's a relationship that they didn't know they had until they got here, and so the pieces are put together. And oftentimes the family member, even if it is a parent who they may be reunifying with, you have to keep in mind that this is a parent who likely fled violence and persecution. And now the child, when they were probably somewhere around the age of the child who's now following them. And it's just a repetition of that same pattern of targeting and oppression by these organized criminal elements. So.
Kayla, we haven't touched at all on the post-release services, family reunification programming. So there is about 10% of children that are going to be released to sponsors will qualify for additional case management services. And Refugee Services of Texas we are under contract negotiation right now with LIRS to provide families with those case management services here in Austin.
That's great. And one thing that I'd like to say is, I just got another, one of the cards was about resources that might be available. So I hope that you all received the survey that we sent out, that ISNA sent out with the notice of this meeting, where it's basically what services are available in the community. So I would ask that you please make sure that the most qualified person at your agency, the one that knows your services the best, fill that out, so that then we can do, on the ISNA side, potentially do some mapping of those kinds of resources. But thank you for bringing that up. Another question is there an opportunity or responsibility of the Austin community to address children not crossing the border and in needed safety? In other words, with increased militarization of the border, what happens to the kids in danger who cannot find safety, and where do we fit into that?
Something we've been hearing about as the numbers have dipped here, and there has been a lull, as we're calling it right now, in the numbers, is reasons why that's occurred. We've heard reports out of ABC News that the Honduran government has authorized their special forces to line the border and create a human wall to prevent children from getting out. This is a tactic employed by Eritrea, one of the most oppressive countries on earth. We've also heard stories of the Mexican police who, I guess, usually run on the bribes of the children to allow them to move up, are now relying on the bribe of our country to round them up and to bottleneck them in southern Mexico. So there's been a lot of forces that have been preventing the children from moving up. There was a train derailment about 10 days ago. A lot of the children ride the tops of these trains called the Beast because they mangle the children as they fall off. And so there was a train derailment. Wonders if that was an accident or not. We've heard that there are thousands and thousands of children right now in Tamaulipas. They were bottlenecked for a while and they were literally just sitting ducks. We've heard stories of just atrocious things happening to particularly girls who were bottlenecked in the border cities and really just out there, just open for exploitation. So a lot of people, churches, individuals have taken these children in, but we're hearing stories about literally thousands and thousands of children who are in the border towns right now. So they need help. Answer your question. They need help, big time. Yeah.
Thank you. So just to be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to conclude the panel discussion. Thank you so much to our experts today for coming.